They called him the liberator, the Dionysus twice born, the stranger who came from the east. People remembered the ivy crown, the flowing hair, and the staff tipped with a pine cone. They remembered the processions at night, torches blazing, drums pounding, voices lifted in chants that blurred the line between joy and frenzy, and always at the center was him. Dionysus was not like the other Olympians. He was never fully at home on Olympus. He was born of a mortal woman, wandered foreign lands, and moved among outsiders, the misfits, the forgotten, the restless. He carried with him both delight and terror. His gifts could lift the heart, dissolve sorrow, and inspire visions, but to resist him was to invite madness. To some, he was the god of wine and revelry, to others a force of unshackling, who stripped away order and left chaos in its place. In his name, people danced, sang, and raged through the night, surrendering to a power greater than themselves. This is the story of Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and madness. Origins. Dionysus's story begins in fire and secrecy. He was the son of Zeus, king of the gods, and Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes. Their union was not born in peace. Hera, the jealous queen of Olympus, made sure of that. When Semele became pregnant, Hera disguised herself as an old woman and planted a seed of doubt in her mind. If Zeus truly was who he claimed to be, why would he not show himself in his full divine glory? Semele asked Zeus for a single favor to see him as he truly was. Bound by his oath, Zeus revealed himself in all his blazing power, and the sight was too much for a mortal to bear. In an instant, Semele was consumed by lightning, her mortal body reduced to ash. Yet in her womb still lived the unborn child. Zeus refused to let that child perish. He plucked him from Semele's body and, in desperation, sewed the infant into his own thigh. There the child grew until it was time to be born once again, this time from the flesh of the king of gods himself. That was why Dionysus was called twice born, a god who carried both mortal fragility and divine immortality. But Hera's hatred did not end with Semele's death. She sent her wrath against the child, hounding him from the moment he was born. To protect him, Zeus disguised Dionysus as a girl and entrusted him to Hermes, who carried him away in secret. Some stories say he was hidden in the care of the nymphs of Mount Nysa, raised in the wild among ivy, vines, and the sound of rushing streams. Others tell of an even stranger beginning. In Orphic traditions, Dionysus is not simply the son of Semele, but an older god reborn. They spoke of Zagreus, the child of Zeus and Persephone, who was torn apart by the Titans. From the ashes of that violent death, Zeus saved a spark and breathed it into a new form. In this telling, Dionysus was more than a god of wine. He was the god of death and rebirth itself, the cycle of destruction that leads to renewal. Whatever the version, one truth remained the same. Dionysus was never fully at home among the Olympians. His birth was marked by secrecy, his childhood by wandering, and his very nature by contradiction. From the moment he drew his first breath, he was both divine and mortal, outsider and immortal heir, destined to walk a path that would unsettle gods and mortals alike. Appearance. The image of Dionysus changed with time, shifting like the god himself. In the earliest days, he was shown as a powerful, mature figure, broad-shouldered, bearded, and robed, a god of the harvest and the vine. He looked like a king who commanded respect, carrying the Thesis, his fennel staff crowned with a pine cone, a symbol of his dominion over growth and vitality. But as centuries passed, his image softened. Artists began to depict him not as a bearded lord, but as a youthful, androgynous figure. His face smooth, his frame slender, his hair long and flowing like waves of dark wine. His eyes were radiant, both alluring and unsettling, reflecting the strange duality of his nature: joy and danger, beauty and madness. To look upon him was to feel pulled in like a moth to flame. His attire was unlike the stern armor of Athena or the regal robes of Hera. Dionysus often appeared draped in loose garments dyed in rich purples and reds, echoing the colors of wine. Around his head twined a crown of ivy or vine leaves sprouting with grapes, as if nature itself bent to his presence. Sometimes he wore the skins of wild beasts, panther, leopard, or bull, signs of his untamed side. Animals followed in his wake, panthers padded at his heels, their golden eyes shining in torchlight. Serpents coiled around his arms or slithered in the ivy he wore. Bulls, with their raw strength and primal energy, were sacred to him. Wherever he appeared, the air carried the scent of crushed grapes, the pulse of drums, and the uneasy sense that order itself was slipping away. Unlike other Olympians, Dionysus's appearance was never fixed. He could come as a radiant youth or as a wild man crowned in ivy. He could be gentle, coaxing mortals into joy and abandon, or terrible, eyes blazing with frenzy. This shifting image was not weakness, it was his essence. Dionysus was transformation itself, a god who defied boundaries, slipping between beauty and terror, man and beast, mortal and divine. Dionysus's place among the Olympians was familial ties, complicated from the very beginning. Familial ties. He was the son of Zeus, yet his mortal mother set him apart from the rest of the divine family. Hera, who despised him before he even drew breath, saw him as a living reminder of Zeus's betrayal. Her hatred followed him all his life, shaping him into the restless god who wandered far from Olympus, often in the company of mortals rather than gods. Despite this, he was never alone. Dionysus was raised in secrecy, watched over by nymphs and later guided by Silenus, the old satyr who became his foster father, teacher, and constant companion. Silenus embodied both wisdom and drunkenness. And in him, we see a reflection of Dionysus himself, a mixture of insight and chaos, always teetering between comedy and tragedy. In love, Dionysus was just as complex. He took both male and female lovers, a sign of his nature as a god unconstrained by mortal customs. His most enduring partner was Ariadne, the princess abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos. To Ariadne, Dionysus gave not only his love but immortality itself, raising her from despair into the halls of the gods. She alone is remembered as his true consort, his queen among the vines. Other companions and loves drifted through his stories. Some tell of his affection for Ampelos, a beautiful youth whose tragic death gave rise to the grapevine itself. Others speak of his many children by Ariadne, by mortal women, and even by nymphs, though few of these offspring carried lasting fame. And then there were his followers, perhaps the most important family he ever claimed. Satyrs with goat legs and mocking laughter, Maenads with wild eyes and ivy-tied hair, and countless mortals who abandoned the rigid structures of society to join his ecstatic rituals. These companions were more than revelers. They were his army, his congregation, his proof that Dionysus was not a god of Olympus alone, but of every field, forest, and street where people longed to escape the weight of order. Thus, Dionysus's relationships tell the story of a god always standing at the threshold. Hated by Hera, legitimized by Zeus, loved by Ariadne, and followed by outsiders. He belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. He was a son of Olympus, but his truest family was made of mortals, spirits, and exiles, those who, like him, walked between worlds. Personality, powers, and roles. To understand Dionysus is to accept contradiction. He was joy and terror, life and death, order and chaos. Mortals who worshipped him called him a liberator, a god who lifted sorrow and loosened the chains of daily life. But those who resisted him, who mocked his rites or denied his divinity, found themselves undone, driven into madness or torn apart by frenzy. At his heart, Dionysus was the god of wine. Not the drink itself, but everything it meant: celebration, release, the dissolving of boundaries. Wine brought laughter, loosened tongues, and blurred the sharp edges of grief. Yet the same cup could lead to violence, delirium, and ruin. In that way, wine mirrored Dionysus perfectly, a gift that could heal or destroy depending on how it was embraced. But his dominion stretched far beyond the vine. He was the god of theater, of masks and transformation, where mortals became someone else under torchlight and songs. He was the patron of actors and storytellers, for performance was its own kind of intoxication, a shift of identity that blurred reality and illusion. Every play performed in ancient Athens' tragedy or comedy began with a prayer to him. He was also a god of fertility and nature, tied to the cycles of growth and decay. His presence was in the bursting grape clusters, the ivy-climbing walls, the wild animals that roared in the night. Like the seasons themselves, Dionysus embodied the eternal rhythm of death and rebirth, winter's silence, followed by the rush of spring. Yet above all, he was a god of transformation. He dissolved boundaries between man and beast, male and female, mortal and divine, sanity and madness. To follow him was to be remade, to step outside the rigid order of the city and enter the wild. His worshippers, the Maenads and Satyrs, surrendered themselves to that power in ecstatic dances, giving up control until they became something more or something less than human. This dual nature made Dionysus unpredictable. He could be gentle, lifting a cup in friendship, leading his followers in joyful song. Or he could be terrible, crowned in ivy and blazing-eyed, punishing kings who mocked him, destroying cities that rejected him. To the Greeks, he was both savior and destroyer, a god who could not be ignored. In the end, Dionysus was not simply the god of wine, but of everything wine represented: release, ecstasy, transformation, and the razor-thin line between pleasure and madness. He was the god of freedom and frenzy, of inspiration and terror. And once his presence arrived, there was no turning back. The city of Thebes, the birthplace of Dionysus and Pentheus, the Bacchae, Dionysus's mortal mother, Semele, was where his divinity was first put to the test. When Dionysus returned as a god grown, crowned in ivy, and accompanied by Maenads, he found a city that had forgotten him. Worse still, its young king, Pentheus, his own cousin, mocked him openly. This is where the tragedy known as the Bacchae begins. Pentheus saw only a threat to order. He called Dionysus's rites disgraceful, accusing the women of Thebes of abandoning their homes to wander the mountains in drunken frenzy. He sneered at the idea that this strange youth, delicate and androgynous, could be divine. To Pentheus, Dionysus was not a god but a charlatan, a fraud leading his people into madness. But Dionysus was not to be dismissed. Disguised as a mortal priest of his own cult, he allowed himself to be brought before Pentheus. The king, unaware of who stood before him, questioned the stranger, mocking his long hair, his soft face, and his flowing robes. Dionysus, calm and unshaken, only smiled and warned him, "Do not fight against the will of a god." Pentheus did not listen. He ordered Dionysus to be chained and imprisoned. Yet no bonds could hold him. While Pentheus scoffed, the palace shook, its walls collapsing, and the stranger slipped free without effort. Still, Pentheus raged, blind to the truth that stood before him. So, Dionysus set the trap. He suggested that if Pentheus truly doubted the rites, he should see them for himself. Disguised as a worshipper, Pentheus could slip into the mountains and witness the Maenads firsthand. Pride and curiosity overcame reason, and Pentheus agreed. Dionysus dressed him in women's clothing, a veil over his head, and led him into the wilderness. There, on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, the Maenads roamed in ecstasy. They crowned themselves in ivy, nursed wolf cubs at their breasts, and pulled streams of wine and milk from the earth with their hands. When they saw Pentheus lurking among them, they did not see a king. They saw prey. The frenzy fell upon him. Seized by divine madness, the women tore him apart with their bare hands. And at the front of the mob was his own mother, Bacchae, who in her delirium believed her son to be a lion. Only when she carried his head back to Thebes, triumphant, did the fog of madness lift and horror fall upon her. Thus, Pentheus, who mocked the god, became a warning to all who denied him. The Bacchae showed that Dionysus could be gentle to those who welcomed him, but merciless to those who resisted. In his rites, joy and terror were two sides of the same coin, and no mortal, no matter how proud, could stand against him. Dionysus and Ariadne and Theseus. On the island of Naxos, beneath the endless sky and the whisper of waves, a young woman woke to find herself abandoned. Ariadne, princess of Crete, had once saved Theseus, the Athenian hero, from certain death in the labyrinth of the Minotaur. She had betrayed her father, King Minos, and her homeland to help him escape. In return, Theseus had promised her love, marriage, and a future. But promises are fragile. Somewhere between Crete and Athens, Theseus left her sleeping on the shore and sailed away. When Ariadne opened her eyes, she was alone, her life in ruins, the sea carrying away the man she had risked everything for. It was then that Dionysus found her. Some say he was drawn to her sorrow, others that he had always intended her as his bride. Where Theseus abandoned her, Dionysus lifted her up. He made her his queen, not with chains or bargains, but with love. He placed a crown upon her head, a diadem said to shine with the light of the stars themselves. When her mortal life ended, he set that crown in the heavens as the constellation Corona Borealis, so her story would never be forgotten. In Ariadne, Dionysus showed a different side of himself. Not the wrathful god who punished Pentheus, but the one who could redeem and elevate. To her, he gave not madness, but immortality. Together, they ruled as consorts, their love bound to the wild rites of Dionysus and to the eternal rhythms of life and death. Yet the shadow of Theseus lingered. In some versions of the tale, Dionysus did not simply take Ariadne as his own, he confronted her faithless lover. Theseus, the pride of Athens, found himself cursed. Some say Dionysus clouded his mind, causing him to forget to change the black sails on his return voyage, leading his father, King Aegeus, to leap to his death. Others whisper that Dionysus's curse struck Theseus's sons, condemning them to tragedy. Whatever the version, the meaning was clear. Where Theseus failed Ariadne, Dionysus fulfilled her. He turned despair into divinity, betrayal into love everlasting. To the Greeks, Ariadne's fate was both warning and comfort, that sometimes, in the deepest sorrow, the gods themselves might intervene. Hey everyone, just a quick intermission here. I wanted to say thank you for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. Did you know that over 80% of you who are watching right now aren't subscribed to the channel? If you've enjoyed this content so far, it would be incredible if you could hit that subscribe button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps the channel grow and ensures that you won't miss any more of the fascinating stories we explore together. Also, if you're feeling generous, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share with anyone else who may enjoy it. Your support really does make a difference and keeps the content coming. Thanks again, and let's get back to the story. Dionysus and the Pirates. There was a time when Dionysus wandered the shores of the Aegean, his form disguised as that of a mortal youth. His beauty caught the eye of a band of sailors who mistook him for a wealthy prince abandoned on the coast. Thinking they had found a prize worth ransoming, they seized him and dragged him aboard their ship. The helmsman, wiser than the rest, felt a shiver of dread. "This is no ordinary boy," he warned his companions. "There is power in his eyes. Release him before it's too late." But the others only laughed, binding their captive and setting sail. At first the ship moved swiftly, but then the air grew heavy and the sea fell unnaturally still. The ropes that bound Dionysus began to slip loose as if cut by unseen hands. The mast creaked, and from its wood sprang twisting vines heavy with grapes. Ivy coiled up the ropes, spilling over the deck wildly. The sailors tried to cut them away. But the more they struggled, the faster the greenery grew, filling every corner of the ship. Then the animals came. A bear prowled the deck, its growl shaking the planks. A lion appeared at the bow, mane blazing in the torchlight, eyes burning with divine fury. The sailors panicked, screaming in terror, and hurled themselves into the sea. Most were swallowed by the waves, but Dionysus was not without mercy. He transformed some of the fleeing men into dolphins so that they might live on as servants of the sea, forever carrying mortals safely to shore in remembrance of their folly. Only the helmsman, who had recognized the truth, was spared without punishment. In that moment, the sailors learned what mortals often forgot. Dionysus was not a god to be mocked or underestimated. He could wear the face of a youth, gentle and radiant, but beneath it lay a force older and wilder than the sea itself. Dionysus and Hephaestus. Not every tale of Dionysus was written in frenzy and blood. Sometimes his power was quieter, born of charm, persuasion, and a cup of wine. Such was the case in the story of Hephaestus, the god of fire and forge. Hephaestus had never forgiven Hera, his mother, for casting him from Olympus when he was born lame and twisted of foot. In vengeance, he fashioned a throne of cunning design, polished with bronze and gleaming with gold. He sent it to her as a gift, but it was a trap. The moment Hera sat upon it, invisible chains snapped shut, binding her fast. No god, not even Zeus, could break the spell. One by one, the Olympians tried to coax Hephaestus into releasing her. He refused. The years of mockery, rejection, and cruelty were too deep. Hera would stay his prisoner, a goddess humbled before them all. It was then that Dionysus stepped forward. Unlike the others, he did not threaten or plead. He invited Hephaestus to drink with him. The wine flowed freely, laughter loosening the smith god's bitterness as Dionysus filled his cup again and again. Hephaestus, awkward and gruff, found himself swaying, his anger dulled by intoxication and by Dionysus's easy company. When the time was right, Dionysus draped an arm around him and led him back to Olympus, stumbling but smiling. The other gods watched in awe as the one they could not move with force or authority was guided home by laughter and drink. At last Hephaestus released Hera, and harmony, if only for a time, was restored. This tale was remembered not as a triumph of strength, but of wit. Where Zeus's thunder and Athena's strategy failed, Dionysus succeeded with charm and intoxication. He reminded the gods that not all power is born from might or wisdom. Sometimes the key to victory lay in laughter, in loosened chains of the heart, and in the strange, disarming truth of wine. Dionysus and King Midas. Among all the mortals who crossed paths with Dionysus, none are remembered more than King Midas of Phrygia. His story began not with the god himself, but with one of Dionysus's closest companions, Silenus, the old satyr who raised him. Silenus, as was often the case, wandered too far in a drunken haze and collapsed in the gardens of King Midas. The king's servants brought him inside, and Midas, treating the stranger with honor, entertained him for 10 days and nights. He offered food, shelter, and laughter, never once mocking his guests' stumbling or slurred speech. On the 11th day, Dionysus came searching for his old companion. When he saw the kindness Midas had shown, he offered the king a reward, one wish, whatever he desired. Midas did not hesitate. He asked for the power that everything he touched might turn to gold. At first, the gift seemed divine. Branches turned to glittering metal at his touch. Pebbles became coins. Bowls became treasure. His palace shone brighter than the sun. Yet the wonder soon gave way to horror. Food turned to gold upon his lips. Wine hardened in his throat, and even his beloved daughter, when she ran into his arms, transformed into a lifeless statue of radiant metal. Desperate, Midas begged Dionysus to take back the gift, and though gods rarely rescinded their blessings, Dionysus showed mercy. He told Midas to wash in the waters of the river Pactolus. There the curse was broken, and the river's sands ever after gleamed with gold. The Greeks told this story not simply as a tale of wealth, but as a warning. Dionysus could grant joy, but but just as swiftly he could turn a man's desires against him. To seek from the god more than release to grasp at power or greed was to invite ruin. And yet in sparing Midas, Dionysus revealed another truth. He was not a god of cruelty, but of balance. He gave, he punished, he forgave. His gifts reflected the hearts of those who received them. And sometimes the harshest lessons were the ones that endured longest. The return to Olympus. For much of his life, Dionysus wandered. He moved through forests and valleys, across seas, and into distant lands, carrying his rites with him. Wherever he went, mortals either welcomed him with open arms or resisted and suffered the price. He was a god of the outsider, living among nymphs, satyrs, and mortals far more than he dwelled in Olympus. But his wandering could not last forever. At last, Dionysus returned to the halls of the gods to claim his place. Yet even then he was not welcomed with open arms. His mortal blood made him an outcast, his ceremonies wild and uncontrollable, unsettling gods who valued order and hierarchy. And all the while, Hera's hatred of him still smoldered. Some whispered that Dionysus had no rightful seat at all, that he was a stranger among his own kin. But Zeus, who had born him into the world from his own flesh, would not allow his son to be cast aside. He insisted Dionysus take his place on Olympus, seated among the 12. And so the god who had been rejected, hidden, hunted, and doubted, became one of the most powerful in the Greek pantheon. He joined not as a conqueror of armies, nor as a master of law or craft, but as the god who blurred boundaries, who belonged nowhere and everywhere. His ascension marked a truth the Greeks could not deny. Even the most unruly, unpredictable forces of life had their place in the divine order. The gods of Olympus were not only the guardians of stability, but also the keepers of chaos, and Dionysus was the proof. From then on, when mortals gathered to drink wine, to perform plays, to dance in revels that broke through the fabric of ordinary life, they did so under the eye of an Olympian. Dionysus was no longer only a wanderer or a stranger. He was a god who had come home, though he would never be tamed. Dionysus and Ampelos. Among the many companions of Dionysus, none was more beloved than Ampelos, a beautiful youth whose name itself meant vine. The god adored him, delighting in his beauty and vitality. And Ampelos basked in the affection of his divine lover. Their days were filled with games, laughter, and the carefree joy of youth, a fleeting paradise under the sun. But paradise never lasts. In some versions, Ampelos grew reckless, daring to ride a wild bull across the fields. The beast threw him, goring and trampling him to death. In others, it was the gods themselves who envied Dionysus's joy and struck Ampelos down. However it happened, tragedy claimed him, and Dionysus wept as though the world itself had been torn apart. From Ampelos's blood and lifeless form, Dionysus brought forth something new, the first grapevine. The fruit that grew upon it carried both sweetness and intoxication, joy and sorrow. When pressed and fermented, its juice became wine, the gift Dionysus would give to humanity, carrying within it the memory of love, loss, and transformation. Thus, Ampelos did not vanish from the world. He lived on in every cup poured in Dionysus's name, in every festival where mortals surrendered to ecstasy, in every ritual where life and death were entwined. The vine itself was a monument to his passing, a reminder that pleasure is born from fragility and that love, even when struck down, can give rise to something eternal. In this story, Dionysus revealed once more his deepest nature, a god of resurrection, of finding life in the midst of death. Ampelos was not just his companion. He was the seed of the god's greatest gift, the living emblem of how beauty can be transformed into something everlasting. Even with tales of love, loss, and resurrection, the ages that followed remembered Dionysus imperfectly. Misconceptions of Dionysus. Over time, Dionysus became one of the most misunderstood gods of the Greek pantheon. To many modern eyes, he is remembered only as the god of drunkenness, a carefree reveler staggering under the weight of his own cup. The Greeks themselves sometimes played with that image in theatre and satire, showing him as a soft, effeminate figure mocked by other gods. But these portraits only scratched the surface of who he truly was. Dionysus was never just the god of wine. Wine was his symbol, not his essence. What he embodied was the power behind wine, the ability to dissolve boundaries, to liberate, to transform. In his myths, wine was not simply a drink, but a doorway, a force that opened mortals to visions, ecstasy, and terror. He was also wrongly reduced to a god of indulgence and excess. In truth, his rites carried discipline and meaning. The Bacchic mysteries were not endless parties. They were sacred rituals carefully structured to bring worshippers to the brink of frenzy and back again. They offered release from sorrow, insight into the cycles of life and death, and to those initiated, a hope of something beyond the grave. Another misconception paints him as an outsider among the Olympians, forever a wanderer who barely belonged. While it is true his mortal origins and restless nature set him apart, Dionysus was not a lesser god. By Zeus's decree, he was an Olympian, and his influence stretched from the forests of Thrace to the theatres of Athens, from the vineyards of the Aegean to the farthest reaches of India. His cult was one of the most widespread in the ancient world, and perhaps the most dangerous misconception of all, to think Dionysus was harmless. His myths stand as warnings against this very belief. Kings who denied him Pentheus, Lycurgus, and others met gruesome ends. To ignore Dionysus was to deny one of the raw forces of existence itself, joy that could turn to madness, life that could turn to death. He was liberation, but he was also punishment. So while later ages mocked him as a figure of excess, the Greeks knew better. Dionysus was not a fool, not a drunkard, not a caricature. He was a god of ecstasy and terror, of love and destruction, a power that defied control. To see him as anything less was to miss the very heart of who he was. Legacy of Dionysus. Though he began as an outsider, Dionysus became one of the most enduring gods of the Greek world, and his influence reached far beyond the vineyards. In Athens, the great theatre festivals, the city Dionysia and the rural Dionysia, were held in his honor. Every tragedy and comedy, every performance that shaped the foundations of Western drama, began as an offering to him. The mask, the stage, the chorus all were born from Dionysus's rites, where mortals transformed into something more, slipping into roles that blurred truth and illusion. His cult spread across the Mediterranean and into Rome, where he became known as Bacchus. There too he was both celebrated and feared. Roman authorities sometimes cracked down on the Bacchanalia, seeing in the wild nocturnal rites a dangerous loss of control, a threat to order. Yet the cults endured, carried by those who longed for release from the rigid lines of society. In philosophy and later thought, Dionysus never vanished. For some, he symbolized the duality of existence, pleasure and pain, life and death, control and chaos. The philosopher Nietzsche would later write of the Dionysian spirit as the raw primal energy that stood opposite the cold order of the Apollonian. In art and poetry, he reappeared again and again, not as a relic of myth, but as an eternal archetype, the god of frenzy, transformation, and unshackled truth. Even today, echoes of Dionysus remain. In the theatre, in festivals, in music that dissolves the self into rhythm, in the shared drink that turns strangers into companions. His shadow lingers wherever boundaries blur, wherever ecstasy breaks through despair, wherever humans seek freedom beyond the ordinary. Dionysus walks. His legacy is not just that of a god of wine, but of a force that revealed the paradox at the heart of life itself. That joy and madness, creation and destruction, are never separate, but bound together. Dionysus remains the eternal stranger, the liberator, the twice-born god who taught mortals that to lose themselves, even for a moment, was to glimpse the divine. And so, as the echoes of his stories fade into the quiet, one truth lingers above all the rest. Dionysus was never simply the god of wine or revelry, nor merely a wanderer crowned in ivy. He was the reminder hidden in every moment of joy and every tremor of sorrow that life is fragile, brilliant, and always transforming. In every cup raised among friends, in every step of a dance, in every performance where a voice trembles and becomes something greater, his presence still murmurs. Not demanding worship, not demanding fear, only a single recognition that within each of us lives the same wild spark that once followed him through forests and moonlit valleys. Perhaps that is why his myth endured, because we all know what it means to lose ourselves for a moment, to feel joy that blurs into something deeper, to face grief that reshapes us, to walk the line between who we are and who we could become. Dionysus lived in that space between boundaries, between breaths, and invited mortals to step across it with him. And whether through laughter, through tears, or through transformation, he offered a glimpse of something eternal shimmering beneath the surface of the ordinary. So tonight, as the world grows quieter and the story settles, let his final lesson linger gently. That freedom is found not in escape, but in understanding the wild, beautiful forces that shape the human heart. And sometimes, in losing ourselves just for a heartbeat, we find the part of us that was divine all along.